Good morning. Welcome to Beyond the Fundamentals. Today we're going to be dealing with Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 verses 1 through 13. And I'm going to have to turn off my own video here where I was monitoring the chat. So it is the first time doing this live. I'm excited to do this. I'm a little bit nervous. I don't have a lot of experience doing this live. I usually record this in advance. And I'm not doing it in advance today. I'm doing it live. So we're all here together for real. I tried to record this in advance, and I sent out an email to the subscribers, so some of you know I had surgery on Wednesday, and I wasn't in the pre-recording attempts, wasn't quite firing on all cylinders, so I had some footage that I'm just not going to use. So we're going to try to go live today and see how this works. So we're in Acts chapter 2. I apologize for the low quality of the video. This is the best I've got for today. All right. So we're gonna make the most of it, and I appreciate your patience with that, and I hope you can still see what we got going on. Yeah, I think the comments about the surgery are real funny. I had my gallbladder taken out on Wednesday, and I had some calcification and stones and stuff like that had to go for a variety of reasons, and it couldn't wait. And when I sent out the announcement, some people responded back because I didn't say what it was. And some people were like, well, I hope you didn't get the uncircumcision because of what the the baptism video. And then somebody else said that their in-group belonging needs were flaring up or something like that. Anyway, it's kind of funny. I really appreciate you guys, a little community that we have here with those of you who watch, those of you who support, and those of you who are on the Zoom channel. I really enjoy the interactions that we have. In Acts chapter 2, this is a very controversial passage because so many people try to use it for so many different things. So what we're going to read the passage, and then we're going to try to sort through some of that information. And I'm going to read verses like 1 through 13 or so, and then we'll go back and start around verse 1. In Acts chapter 2, verse 1, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Ghost, and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. And there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. Now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded, because that every man heard them speak in his own language. And they were all amazed and marveled, saying one to another, Behold, are not all these which speak in Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born? Parthians, and Medes, Elamites, and the dwellers in Mesopotamia, and in Judea, and in Cappadocia, and Pontus, and in Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, and Egypt, and in the parts of Libya about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians, we do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God. And they were all amazed, and were in doubt, saying one to another, What meaneth this? And others mocking said, These men are full of new wine. And then Peter stands up and starts talking. So we're going to stop there at verse 13 and start looking at this passage. I'm going to try to go till about 11:30 or so, and then we're going to cut it off for today, just so you have an expectation of how far this is going to go. So when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. So who is the they all that are within one accord in one place? If we back up to Acts chapter 1, verse 14, it says, These all continued with one accord in one place, in prayer and in one accord, in prayer and supplication with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brethren. And they just got through naming the 11 apostles, and they're about to replace Judas there. And it says that Peter stood up in those days in the midst of the disciples and said that, and the numbers of the name were about 120 people. So what we're looking at in the one accord in one place in Acts chapter 2, verse 1, they're in this house in Jerusalem, and there's about 120 people there, and this includes not only the 11 apostles, but they replaced Judas with Matthias. So now there's 12 apostles again. And they're all together at Pentecost, and they're in that house, wherever it is, in Jerusalem. And when the day of Pentecost was fully come. Now, what I want to show you next is just a few thoughts about Pentecost. What happens in Pentecost? I think, in case you don't know the story, it is the big speaking in tongues event of the book of Acts. The biggest speaking in tongues event that there is starts in Acts 2. Now, there are 3 times that speaking in tongues happens in the book of Acts. In Acts 2, it is the preachers doing, the people who are already believers are doing the speaking in tongues. And there are 29 conversion accounts in the book of Acts. And in Acts chapter 10, the converts speak in tongues. And in Acts chapter 19, the converts speak in tongues. So for 27 accounts, including Acts 2, the converts do not speak in tongues. So there are only 3 tongue-speaking events in the book of Acts. One of them is the preachers, 2 of them are the converts, and of the converts, one time it's Gentiles, second time it's Jews. And each time there's, Jews require a sign, but Greeks seek after wisdom. The Jews started off with signs as a nation. So when Moses came to prove he was who he was, I'm talking about back in the book of Exodus, God gave him signs like turning water into blood, turning rods into snakes, and healing leprosy out of them. So there's always been signs to prove to the Jews that whatever's going on is an authentic progression of what God intends to happen, and that some charlatan isn't coming along with something to try to lie to everyone. That's why Jews require a sign. They've always been given signs. They require a sign. And then, so these signs, each time these signs show up, they're there to show the Jews something. That God is doing something. There's some kind of transitional thing that's happening, and he's verifying that transition with the sign. Okay? So when the day of Pentecost was fully come, there are denominations. So let's think of it this way too. Acts is it's an event. Acts 2 is an event. It's an event that transpired. And one of the ways we want to understand events is to try to separate ourselves from them. We tend to read the Bible with an immediate mind of impact of what does this mean to me? Like what do I need to do with this? What do I need to believe or do as a result of this? And because people jump the gun on that, and they do that too fast, they start trying to make doctrine out of what they find in the book of Acts as soon as it shows up. So when you see this event happen, there are some denominations that teach that this event should happen every time we have church, or this event should happen, so that kind of thing. Now, you wouldn't do that with other events. Think of local events today. Think of how people are, when something happens in the news, say especially with the angst about the police activities, with minorities, stuff like that, when something happens today, how many narratives generate as a result of one event? A whole bunch of narratives. There's a whole bunch of stories floating around about what this means and what this implies and what this tells us about the system, that kind of stuff. And the narratives don't match, so they can't all be true. And the narratives all go down to dealing with exactly like representing or misrepresenting what actually happened. And there's a lot of assumptions that go into what actually happened. Y'all remember the football players coming out after one of these events, and they're all holding their hands up to do the hands up, don't shoot thing. Well, the narrative they were talking about, that nobody ever held their hands up and said don't shoot. That never happened. But it was a narrative that became popular, and people employed that narrative. And I'm going to use a 50-cent word here in a minute. They employ the narrative with agentic bias. That's what I want. That's the 50-cent word I want you to get here. Agentic bias. So what is agentic bias? So agentic has to do with the word agency. And the agency is, when you have agency, you have the capacity to do something, either on your own behalf or on the behalf of something else. And so a narrative is intended to have agency. In other words, it's intended to accomplish something. And a lot of the narratives that come out of Acts 2 have an agentic bias. And what that is, it's a story that's designed to make people think a certain way, that bolsters the likelihood of success of the people who all happen to follow a certain narrative or paradigm. Now, your job for sense-making purposes, our job for sense-making purposes, is to be the kind of person who can be familiar with the source material as much as is possible. Now, thankfully, we have this written down. And in some cases, in current events, we're not exactly sure what's going on because we weren't there, and there is no authoritative account. But we have, I think, what we would all agree is an authoritative account of what happened. And so we try to separate the authoritative account and identify things that are variant. That means things that are different, variant things. There's invariant things and there's variant things. We try to identify the things that are variant in the narratives from the historic account and then not consider those into our sense making. And if you see a group of people that has a whole bunch of agentic bias in their narrative, or a whole bunch of things that are invariant, that would tell you that they have a whole bunch of agentic bias. They're trying to persuade people in a certain way that bolsters the likelihood of success for their in-group that is attached to a certain narrative or paradigm that is not necessarily in alignment with what is considered to be true from the actual event itself. I hope you're following me on that. So Acts 2 is kind of like Genesis in a way. And I'm going to tell you why. And there's a few reasons why. Number one is the beginning of something. This is the first forward-facing ministry attempt of the apostles without Jesus Christ. So Jesus is dead. Then he rose again, hung out with them for 40 days, and they're all kind of basically reconsolidating, getting their act back together. And you have some things like in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to over more than 500 at once, But the idea, that's what Jesus is doing. The idea of the apostles coming together and they actually do a forward-facing, public-facing ministry attempt to witness on behalf of Jesus Christ. This is the first time that's happening. So this is the start of that, okay? Other things are like Genesis. You'll find different people point out that in the book of Genesis, you have the Tower of Babel, and in the Tower of Babel, all the languages get confounded, so nobody can understand each other in Genesis 11. And here you have what you might call good guys speaking, people commissioned by the Lord to do the speaking, and everybody can hear in their own language. So you have like a reverse Babel going on. I think Ruckman mentioned that in his commentaries on this. Several other people have, and I think Michael Heiser has some very interesting stuff on that in his book, The Unseen Realm. I found Michael Heiser to be quite interesting to listen to. I don't agree with everything he says, but he's interesting to listen to because his thinking is divergent from what the mainstream is. It's obvious that he has conducted his own sense making and isn't just relying on other people, but he's both conducting analysis and synthesis of other information to pull together what he thinks is going on, which makes him interesting. Is one of the very few people who are actually interesting to listen to these days, because it seems that everybody else that I try to listen to is boring because they are just passing along or trying to bolster the narrative that they got from somewhere else. That's boring to me. I don't want to do that. I don't enjoy listening to people who do that, and I don't want you to do that. I want us to be able to examine the text for ourselves and say what it is we think we're saying. So the whole connection between Babel and Acts 2, read Michael Heiser's book on that. He's probably got some YouTube videos out there about it too. So you might find that interesting if you want to look into that. So Pentecost happens once per year. And I'm going to show you this on a calendar. Let me go over to my handy dandy slides. And these slides aren't working too well. There we go. Handy dandy slides. What you're looking at here is a calendar of the feasts of Israel. And in the spring feast, you have the first fruits, unleavened bread, and Passover. And then over here toward the summer, you have Pentecost. The Pentecost usually happens about in June for us. Now, the Jewish calendar has the months, they have 360 days in a regular year. So there's 364 and a half days in a year, or 0.25, something like that. So their calendar is going to be off. So they developed a system. They have a lunar calendar, and they follow what's called a metatonic cycle. And there is a 19-year cycle. And out of 19 years, there are 8 of them where they add an entire month to the calendar. So you can't say Pentecost is always June 8th. You can't say that because it kind of shifts back and forth depending on how they're doing their calendar. It'll back up, then they do their leap year where they add a whole month, whereas we add one day every 4 years. They add a whole month 8 times out of 19 years. So that's kind of interesting. This is one of those things. I did a video back when we were doing the Awakening the Spirit series, and which kind of got terminated because of COVID restrictions. We never picked it back up, even though our intent was to still be going today initially. But I did something where we're trying to triangulate what God is doing. And what I showed you is that if you keep your eyes on the Jews, and you keep your eyes on the Bible and on the land of Israel, and what the Bible says about these things and what's going on in current events, you can kind of track what God is doing in society and in time and in history and follow that through. And those are also authenticating metrics. Something that I would add to that as a caveat, not as a fourth thing, but in there with the Jews and the Bible, is the calendar system that they're given, the feast system. The feasts all represent something, and they are all literally fulfilled. And so the Feast of Passover, Christ was literally the Passover, and then he said, eat my flesh and drink my blood. So he's literally the unleavened bread. Not literally, because they're not cannibals. They don't actually eat his flesh and drink his blood. The words that I speak are spirit and truth. Flesh profiteth you nothing, Jesus said. Okay? But he is the unleavened bread. He's the fulfillment of that, why that's done. And then if you're interested in why they would eat his flesh and drink his blood, figuratively, look at Rene Girard's scapegoat theory. I think that's very interesting. So I encourage you to look into that when you get a chance. You can probably watch some videos on it if you don't want to read the book. And then he's literally the Feast of First Fruits. On the 17th, he comes back up out of the grave on the Feast of First Fruits. So he literally is that. Now, the ark also landed on the mountains of Ararat on the Feast of First Fruits on Nisan the 17th. So that's kind of interesting. Then you have Pentecost, and Pentecost is literally fulfilled here in Acts chapter 2. In Sivan 6th or 7th, depending on how the months go, they decide what day of the week that's going to be, what day of the month that's going to be. It's usually either on the 6th or the 7th. Now that's literally fulfilled. Interestingly, Enoch. This is not in your Bible, so I'm not saying this is dogmatically true, but Enoch, legend has it, that Enoch was born and he was taken up on the day of Pentecost, at Pentecost, which is kind of interesting. So if you were to do types and things like that from the Old Testament, Enoch would be a type of the church, and then following Enoch being taken away, your Noah and his family would be a type of the Jews going through the tribulation, that kind of thing. So if that typology is true, and I'm not saying necessarily that it is, but I want us to be able to explore all kinds of things, whether or not we agree with them, so that we're familiar with them. But if that kind of thing is true, it would make sense that the church would be taken up on the same day that it started. So if we say the church starts, and I'll talk more about this in a second. So if the church starts in Acts 2 on Pentecost, then it, like Enoch, may be taken up on Pentecost as well, which would explain why Jesus says in John chapter 4, he spends 2 days with, after a Samaritan woman, he spends 2 days there with these Gentiles before he goes back, which is, days is 1,000 years is his day. Maybe why he goes, it could be a picture of Christ spending time with the Gentiles during the church age before he goes back to spending time with the Jews. And then he says, are there not 4 months until the harvest? And you can count them on this chart, 1, 2, 3, 4, before you start getting the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles and all that. Now, the Feast of Trumpets, interestingly, coincides with when we think Jesus was actually born. We think Jesus was probably born sometime, what would be on our calendar, around September 23rd, around the Feast of Trumpets, not December 25th, which is more of a pagan holiday that was converted by pagan Rome. They were converting Roman paganism for political purposes, so they had to find equivalent holidays to match everything. So that's when the idea of Jesus' birth getting shifted to December happened back then in the 4th century. But he was probably actually born around the end of September, sometime around the 23rd of September or so. Now, what all this means is that we're anticipating a complete fulfillment of these the fall feasts, trumpets, atonement. Then those are going to be literally fulfilled as much as the other ones were literally fulfilled. Now, speaking of the start of the church, let me quickly hit on this real quick. I am not a fan of the question or in exploring when did the church start. And I don't think that's the right question. That's why. Think about where the church is today. And a better question would be, what series of events transpired that transitioned things into the church that we have today? So there's not any one particular event. So yes, Acts 2 is a major event. That's probably when the Holy Spirit started putting people into the body of Christ. That's when I would trace that back to. Hold that in high probability space at least, but still willing to talk about it. The body possibility, according to Ephesians 2, goes back to Jesus on the cross. Okay, so you can't have Acts 2 without Jesus on the cross. So you have events that don't all happen at the exact same time. And even in Acts 2, there's no Gentiles getting saved yet. That's important. And there's no apostle to the Gentiles yet. So before we can get where we are, we need an apostle to the Gentiles to write all the books that we follow. You know, the books of Romans through Philemon are all written through Paul, all written by Paul. And that's what he's the apostle to the Gentiles. If we're going to follow those, we can't really have a church that's following those if they're not written yet. So instead of asking the question, when did the church start? Beside the idea that church is a nebulous word, rather ask what series of events led to where we are, where the church should be today. Now, you know me, we're doing the Full Stature Initiative here. I don't think the church should stop transitioning at all, because I think in Ephesians chapter 4, we should be pretty familiar with this. The church should have some more transitions. If we go to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 13, now if you've been following, you know where I'm going with this. But you have a model of edification going on in Ephesians 4, 11, and 12. Let me change this over here so I can see this better. You have a model of edification going on in Ephesians 4, 11, and 12. And then it shifts in verses 13 through 16. Till something happens. Till we all come to the knowledge of the Son of God, perfect man, measure the stature of the fullness of Christ, and eventually where everybody, every part of the body is edifying the body. Every part is edifying every other part. So these, a lot of the denominations, you'll hear them say, well, we want to have an Acts chapter 2 church. Why? Why would you want that? That's like a person saying, I'm trying to get back to my toddler self. Why would you want to do that? You wouldn't want to do that. You might want to get to your 25-year-old self. You probably wouldn't even want to get to your 20-year-old self. Maybe just physically, but your mind doesn't start. Your prefrontal cortex doesn't start growing until you're about 65. I hear, something like that. Aristotle wouldn't teach people until they were 30. He wouldn't teach people until they were 30. The Jewish Kabbalists won't let people in to be Kabbalists until they're 40. Okay? So the idea that we recognize people's brains develop and mature and aren't quite ready at a certain time, that's shared knowledge across different societies. And so the idea of going back, why would you want to have an Acts 2 church? Why would you want to have an Acts church at all? Acts is the beginning of something, and that beginning is very problematic. And in Acts 2, there's no Gentiles. So if you were to have an Acts 2 church, you couldn't have any Gentiles in your church. Okay, you couldn't have an apostle to the Gentiles, and you couldn't have any of the New Testament because it hasn't been written yet. So you don't want, so when people talk about the church fathers and you want to get back to the church fathers, see how they did things, no. We're supposed to be doing this Ephesians chapter 4 shift, which did not happen back then, and from what I can see, hasn't happened yet, okay? So we want to progress and move forward. I mean, who would say, man, I wish we could just get back to the iPhone 1. Man, those were good old days. I wish we could just get back to the Commodore 64. Who wants to do that? I wish we could get back to the days of 64 kilobyte RAM. You would never need more than that. I think Bill Gates said something like that. You never need more than 64 kilobytes of RAM. I'm talking to you right now on a computer that has 32 gigs of RAM, and the computer that I usually use when I usually have my other setup has 128 gigs of RAM on that computer. So things change. Which one do you want to use? Can I talk to you on a Commodore PC-10? No, I could not. So we want things in there to progress toward their mature format. Now, change for the sake of change, of course, isn't always good, and I understand that. Now, Pentecost. It says, when the day of Pentecost was fully come. So should we be trying to mimic Pentecost? Now, remember, Peter's wrong in the book of Acts. Paul, during the time frame, because in Galatians 2, Paul has to withstand him to the face. You have people like Diotrephes. You have Alexander the coppersmith. You have Hymenaeus and Philetus. You have all kinds of bad guys during the book of Acts. You have people preaching false doctrine in Acts 15:24. So you don't want to mimic that. They had all kinds of problems in the book of Acts. And by the time John's writing in the book of Revelation, you have false apostles, people claiming to be apostles which aren't apostles. And that kind of thing happens. That's what's going on in the book of Acts. You don't want to mimic that. You don't want to have a rivalrous dynamic that mimics that kind of thing. Now, when the day of Pentecost was fully come. So when did Pentecost happen? Pentecost happened once a year on the day of Pentecost, like the chart that we just showed you. Does it happen every week? No. Should it happen every time that you meet? No. There's a big hint here that when it says was fully come, that this is an indication by Luke that by the time he's writing this, he understands this event to be the fulfillment of the day of Pentecost. Let me give you an example. I'm going to go to Acts chapter 20, verse 16. And we see here that Paul wants to go to Jerusalem by the day of Pentecost. Now, this is years later. He wants to go to Jerusalem. He says, for Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. Now, in the very next chapter, you see he's in Jerusalem, and it's he's there. He makes it by the day of Pentecost, and he goes to Jerusalem, and it's Pentecost, and you got all the people there. This is a different James here, because this is not the one that got killed in Acts chapter 12. But James and all the elders were present, so this is the James that's still alive, the brother of Jesus. And Paul's going to go in and take this vow and go in and do this animal sacrifice and that kind of thing to show that he follows the law, which I'm with the people who think that he should not have been doing that, and he was told 3 times not to do it. But the point is this. It is Pentecost again, and all the stuff that happens in Acts 2 does not happen at this Pentecost. That's what you have to get. There is no reason to believe that the events that transpired in Acts chapter 2 have to transpire again, or that you have to be part of a church service that tries to recreate any or all of the phenomena that took place in Acts chapter 2. We're never told that they take place again, and we're never directed to try to make Acts chapter 2 happen again. We're actually directed to try to move on to perfection, like Hebrews 6 says, to move on to the full stature of Christ, like Ephesians chapter 4 says. We're directed to move on. This is an origin thing. Just like we don't need to build an ark like Noah did, we don't need to take our son to a mountain to sacrifice him like Abraham did. We don't need to actually be in the Garden of Eden with the tree of knowledge and good and evil like Adam and Eve were. Those are events that transpired. And just as we don't feel any need or compulsion to try to recreate those events, Acts 2 should be seen in the same way. In the same way. There's no reason to try to recreate it. I encourage people to read historic events in the book of Acts as a starting place, as if you are a completely disinterested party. Like, say you're an alien from another planet and you're studying the religious writings of some indigenous people on a different planet that don't even apply to you. Read it that way first, okay? We are given in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 32. That did not take. 1 Corinthians 10:32. Paul gives us three different kinds of people. He says, give offense neither to the Jews, to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God. And I want to encourage you to try to use this as like a litmus test, or not really a litmus test, but kind of a measuring stick for how directly something should apply to you. And what I mean by that is, first of all, every passage in Scripture can apply to us today somehow, but that application is very often not a direct application. For example, we don't actually have to go build an ark. Now, we can apply that passage in a lot of different ways about Noah building the ark and that sort of thing. We can apply it in a lot of different ways. We can apply the story in a lot of different ways of Abraham taking Isaac up and being willing to sacrifice him. But we don't actually have to mimic those instructions, okay? And that's what we need to remember. Even in the New Testament, when we see instructions, pay very close attention who's giving the instructions, who's receiving the instructions, and what transitions have transpired so far at that point, and ask these kinds of questions. Is it to the Jews? Is it to Gentiles? Or is it to the church of God? Ask those questions. Then ask, what are you? If you are unsaved, you are either a Jew or a Gentile. If you are saved, you are part of the church of God, whether you are a Jew or a Gentile. So you're going to bear that in mind. And when you're in Acts chapter 2, there are no Gentiles there. It's all Jews and Jewish proselytes. Okay? So as a Gentile who is a member of the church of God, I'm watching this with a grain of salt, and I just want to understand what happened. I don't feel like I need to mimic what is being said necessarily in Acts 2, just like these other passages. So we did not get very far. If I'm in Acts chapter 2, we looked at verse 1 really, and I want to stop at 11:30 because we're going live, and I don't want to drag this out or become tedious, and I want to let you get back to your day. So when we come back, so Wednesday we're going to have our Zoom meeting, and we'll discuss this and the previous session that we had on replacing Judas. We'll do that this coming Wednesday. And then next Sunday, when we come back together, we're going to start talking about these different phenomenon that happened in Acts 2 when they started speaking in tongues. And I've found this very interesting to study, and I can't wait to share with you some of the things that I've found. I think you're going to find them very interesting too. So thanks for watching. May the Lord bless you, and good day.